Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm Lucia Leis. I'm the director of the Bill Center. It's great to see many of you. Also on Zoom, there's a large crowd. Before we get started, I'm going to do some promotion. 2 reminders. In 2 weeks, a little bit less than 2 weeks, we'll be hosting a very hard-hitting one-day symposium on the making and unmaking of property, co-organized by our 2 current Bill postdoctoral fellows, Sonali Dampa and Chelsea Spencer, who, despite the fact that they work on different things, or maybe because they work on different things, have concocted this wonderful event, so please come. This term, the Bureau is also co-sponsoring 2 events which are organized by other units on campus. One is this conference organized by the Beyond France seminar, which is called Unsettled in Dakar. That's on Friday, March 27th. And the GSAP Architecture PhD Students Biennial Colloquium, this year named On the Edge of Legibility. And that's on Thursday, April 2nd and Friday, April 3rd. So on to today's event. It's the first in what we're calling the Encounter series. The series originates, I thought I would say a few words. The series originates in a question that the Buell team, by which I mean a roving group, not roving, evolving group of graduate, postgraduate, and not undergraduate, but of researchers, has been asking itself over the last few years, namely, how do you escape the exceptionalism and the inherited temporal and historic boundaries that are temporal and geographic boundaries, really, that are implied in the name and the mission of the Buell, which is the study of American architecture. How do you, so to speak, make a hemispheric turn? And so you can learn from a vibrant group of architectural historians which exist in our field to study continuations, survivances that have marked American built environment more broadly, despite the ruptures, political ruptures such as the American Revolution. And I won't go into those, but there are the beginnings of research forays that some of our students have done, survivances of haciendas, borrowings of, I'm told that Byron knows the music to this, Lucia, so. Transformations in architectural and urban space across the centuries, including transfers of property, the creation and privatization of commons, the invention of architectural typologies, the hybridization of architectural typologies, etc. So you can do this kind of research, which is very expansive, but it's really not easy being hemispheric. Even if you add an S to the word Americas, there's inevitably methodological hurdles, clashes in research cultures, even differences in the kinds of archives that people have access to in different locales. And so one way to approach this is to stage the Americas more broadly and in the longue durée as a site of encounters. So you'll find our friends in anthropology and archaeologists who are smiling to themselves in the back because they, of course, encounters is what they do. And indeed, there's a kind of strong, recent theoretical lineage that helps us think about encounters from anthropology. I'll just cite 2. Eduardo Rivera de Castro, who's taught us to think of cannibalism as a kind of encounter, radically re-theorizing it. And from a kind of different branch of anthropology, the David Graeber and David Wengrow lineage, which minds meetings between just native intellectuals and European imperialists to re-theorize no less than the whole of capitalism. So the goal of this event, this series, is a little bit more modest, but nevertheless, to ask how architecture in the built environment can be seen both as a site and a subject or object of the kind of encounters we're talking about. To hypothesize that such a variegated repertoire of encounters and changes is always accompanied by transfers of architectural knowledge. And I just want to say one more point to be clear that these events that we're talking about, these encounters, so-called encounters, are often very violent, and indeed that they're intended to have a devastating human and spatial impact. And yet, and as a historian of destruction, I know I'm particularly attuned to this, that there's always a gap between the intended violence and the architectural or spatial index of that violence. So historians of the built environment always know that knowledge and spatial paradigms are created out of violence and destruction and imperialism, old and new. So, for the first of these Encounter series events, who better to invite than someone who's authored a big book by no less than the Getty series on the creation of the Colonial Americas. So I'm very happy to have to welcome Byron Hamann, who I have worked with for many years, but only met in person today. So there he is. He'll present research from a new book titled At the Butterfly House, on the voyage of 4 Nahua representatives, there he is, who traveled to Rome in 1529. So quick bios. Byron received a dual PhD in Anthropology and History from the University of Chicago. He is an editor emeritus of Grey Room. He's the author of a number of texts in addition to the one I just cited, including The Translation of Nebrija, Bad Christians, New Spain, such a good title. And then he continues, Muslims, Catholics, and Native Americans in the Mediterratlantic World. Byron is co-editor with Felipe Rojas and Benjamin Anderson of Otros, pasados, which brings me to our respondent. Ben Anderson is Associate Professor of History of Art and Classics at Cornell. Ben is also very productive. He is the author of Cosmos and Community in Early Medieval Art, co-editor of Antiquarianisms, The Byzantine Neighborhood, Otros, pasados, Is Byzantine Studies a Colonialist Discipline? Other things, and he's also put out an edition of Robert Wood's Ruins of Palmyra and Baalbek, which is very beautiful if you can get your hands on it. So, Byron will speak for 40 minutes, Ben will respond for 10, then we'll open it up. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, thank you, Lucia, for that introduction, and hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today I'm going to talk about a book that I've been working on for the past few years. As you heard, about the journey of 4 Mesoamericans from central Mexico to Rome and back in 1520 and 29. I'm going to give a short intro to the overall project first, and then I'll focus on arguments from chapters 3, 4, and 5 that talk about questions of architecture and encounters specifically, which is, of course, the theme, as we just heard, of this spring's Encounter series at the Buell. So when Lucia and I were talking about this chat, she asked me to highlight questions of method. How do I go about thinking histories of architecture, ruination, and reconstruction in situations for which the buildings I'm interested in, non-elite housing above all, don't survive physically above ground, for which we have very little archaeological evidence, and basically no early modern floor plans or even depictions. All of which means that we need to study these buildings and the cityscapes they created based on different genres of alphabetic documentation, and for all sorts of reasons, the genres of documents we have for 1520s Rome are different from the genres of documents we have for 1520s Mexico-Tenochtitlan. Chat has 3 parts. Intro to the book, At the Butterfly House, Part 2 Rome, Part 3 Mexico-Tenochtitlan and its northern sister city, Tlatelolco. Part 1. At the Butterfly House. So the book project, as you just heard, is called At the Butterfly House, Nahua Ambassadors in the Ruins of Rome, 1529. The title alludes to mid-16th century song lyrics in Nahuatl that imagine Rome as a place where the Pope's home lies painted in golden butterflies. These songs clearly draw on deep pre-Hispanic traditions, but they're also obviously filled with references to Catholicism, and they're also written alphabetically and imported European technology. My book is basically a there and back again story that takes place 500 years ago. It tells how a group of 60 Mesoamerican nobles and courtiers and entertainers traveled to Spain with conquistador Hernando Cortez in the spring of 1528. 4 of those travelers then continued on to Rome, met with Pope Clement VII in mid-April 1529, were granted 4 papal bulls in support of specific Nahuatl churches in central Mexico, and then went home. However, mid-April 1529 was a very strange time for 4 Mesoamericans to visit Rome. The Pope himself had only moved back to Rome 6 months before, and the reason he'd been living in exile outside of the Holy City for nearly a year was because in early May 1527, so less than a year before the Mesoamericans arrived in mid-April 1529, Rome itself had been sacked and looted by imperial troops loyal to Carlos V, Holy Roman Emperor, in his struggles with the King of France for dominion over the Italian peninsula. The devastated city of Rome was then occupied for nearly a year, and the imperial soldiers finally left for good in mid-February 1528. But of course, Rome is not the only holy city imagined as a center of sacred empire to be sacked and looted by soldiers loyal to Carlos V in the 1520s. The same fate befell Mexico-Tenochtitlan in 1521, Mexico-Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire. Now, as it happens, one of the ambassadors to Rome in 1529, Hernando de Tapia, was son of the Nahua governor of Mexico-Tenochtitlan. So he would have lived through his hometown's devastation. One of his travel companions to Rome, Benito de Rada Mazatlqueni, was from Tlaxcala, a pre-Hispanic polity, one valley to the east, that had resisted incorporation into the Aztec Empire, and thus provided Hernando Cortez with thousands of Nahua troops for the invasion and conquest of Mexico-Tenochtitlan. In other words, my story of a visit of Mesoamericans to Rome in 1529 requires me to tell a connected Mediterranean Atlantic story, or as I like to say, Mediterratlantic story. What was it like for participants in and witnesses to the destruction of Mexico-Tenochtitlan in 1521 to find themselves less than a decade later in the ruins of another sacred capital. So, on starting the project, I knew about 3 key 16th century sources about the 1529 Nahua visit to Rome. There are 2 brief mentions in a set of 1520s economic records, now in the Archive of the Indies in Seville. There are 2 very long sentences in Vatican courtier Paolo Giovio's 1551 praise of men illustrious for courage of war. And there are 2 paragraphs in Bernal Diaz del Castillo's 1560s True History of the Conquest of New Spain. Now, none of these sources was actually written in late 1520s Rome, and so when I started this project, I set out to see if I could locate documents about the trip in Italian archives, and I've had a bit of luck with this. So it had been known since the 19th century that Conquistador Hernando Cortés was granted 3 papal bulls by proxy in Rome on April 16, 1529, because copies of them existed in the archives of the Mexico City hospital that Cortés founded. So using those references, and with help from Vatican archivist Francesco Lipa, back in the fall of 2019, I was able to locate copies of the 4 previously forgotten papal bulls in support of specific indigenous churches in Tlaxcala, Culhuacan, Mexico-Tenochtitlan, and Tlatelolco. What you see here are a few pages from paper copies of the bulls copied into Vatican registry books. The original documents would have each been written on a separate sheet of parchment, something like this, and then folded and sealed with a lead disc, so something like this. Like the bulls for Cortés, these are dated April 16, 1529, and the details of the towns they're in and the saints they're dedicated to are all very fascinating and deeply actively politicized in terms of Mesoamerica in the late 1520s. But since I want to keep this talk at 20 minutes, I actually can't go into details today, alas. Back to the sources. In the summer of 2020, thanks to tips from David Kim and Martin Ng about Vatican economic records that ended up in Florence, I was able to find documentation of the gifts of clothing and a golden necklace given to the Mesoamerican visitors by the Pope in Rome in the spring of 1529. And crucially, the clothing gift specifies the number of Mesoamerican visitors to Rome as 4, quattro indiani. And then over a year ago, I was able to find the rough draft petition for this group of papal bulls copied in the Supplications Register section of the Vatican Archives. Terrible handwriting, but the document reveals a lot. And as with the bull copies we just looked at, this is an on-paper copy for Vatican record keeping. The original supplication document would have been written on both sides of a single sheet of loose paper. That's now lost. So, those are key sources on the Nahua visit to Rome and key documents for the book, which has 5 chapters. Chapter 1, 1521-1527, sets up a background with the horrific but unsurprising parallels between what took place during the invasion of Tenochtitlan in 1521 and the invasion of Rome in 1527. Chapter 2, Into the East, tracks how from February 1528 to April 1529, this group of over 60 Mesoamerican nobles and courtiers and entertainers traveled across the Atlantic and throughout Iberia with Conquistador Hernando Cortés. The group spends the winter of 1528-29 in Toledo with Emperor Carlos V, and while they're there, they're visited by an artist from Augsburg, Christoph Weiditz, who in a famous costume book that many of you obviously know, painted images of Cortés, a self-portrait of Weiditz himself in winter clothing, and images complicated of various Mesoamerican travelers, including 2 ball players, and also a log juggler, perhaps one of the 2 log jugglers who goes to Rome. So in March 1529, that's the winter, 1528-29, March 1529, the group splits up. Cortés heads west to Béjar for his second wedding. Most of the Mesoamericans head south to Seville to get ready to go home. But 4 of the Mesoamericans accompanied Emperor Carlos V on his journey east to Saragossa, then head north to Barcelona, and then continue on to Rome, arriving in the middle of April 1529. Chapter 3, The Ruins of Rome, then rewinds back in time 14 months and focuses on Rome, reconstructing the different ways that Roman men and women worked to rebuild their desecrated city from mid-February 1528 to mid-April 1529. The occupying troops, again, had left Rome on February 17th, 1528. So basically at the same time that across the Atlantic, Cortez and the Mesoamerican travelers are in Veracruz preparing to set sail across the Atlantic. So chapters 2 and 3 tell chronologically parallel stories, February 1528 to April 1529. Chapter 2, tracking from Mexico City to Veracruz, across the Atlantic, throughout Iberia, and then to Rome. And then chapter 3, focused on Rome itself. Chapters 2 and 3, these two parallel timelines then come together in chapter 4 at the Butterfly House, which tells of the mid-April 1529 visit of the Nahuas to Rome. Above all, how they would have moved through this city in reconstruction as part of the multi-site bureaucratic process to produce those 4 papal bulls in support of 4 specific churches for Nahua communities back in central Mexico. Then finally chapter 5, Going Home, tells how 2 at least of the Nahua visitors to Rome returned to Iberia. Benito de Rada Mazatlocani rejoins his fellow Mesoamerican travelers in Seville, and then they set sail back for Mesoamerica in late August 1529. Hernando de Tapia seems to have sailed home slightly later in the year. Then from Seville, the rest of chapter 5 moves back to Mesoamerica to talk about the 4 Mesoamerican communities and churches that had been granted these papal bulls in mid-April 1529, again, all of which have fascinating stories to tell. And today's focus, as I mentioned, is on chapters 3, 4, and 5. 2 final introductory points. First, and not incidentally, in terms of their occupied urban footprints, Rome and the island of Mexico-Tenochtitlan, Tlatelolco, were comparable in size, circa 1520, about 2.5 miles north to south and 2 miles east to west. In addition to comparable physical size, the 2 cities also had roughly the same population, circa 1520, around 55,000 inhabitants. Second final intro point. When I started this project, I knew that the rebuilding of Tenochtitlan into Mexico City had been very well studied, above all from the point of view of the Spanish 13 by 13 traza at the rebuilt city center. It's highlighted here. It took up about a quarter of the island, and it was built around the pre-Hispanic ceremonial center of Aztec Tenochtitlan, which is highlighted in red. There are 3 canonical volumes that have studied the building of this Spanish traza, plus a more recent publication that focuses on the Nahua neighborhoods that surrounded the traza, and this is Barbara Mundy's deservedly prize-sweeping book. So when starting the project, I assumed that the same richness of scholarly studies would exist for post-Sac Rome, so that in order to tell my narrative of a Nahua visit in 1529, I just had to find documents on the Central Mexicans and then add them to a history of Rome in the late 1520s that was already thoroughly written. But actually this wasn't the case. Very little has been written on Rome in the years after the sack, the years I'm interested in. Most histories of Renaissance Rome go up to 1527 and then pick up again in the mid-1530s with the urban reforms of Pope Paul III. So the history of a devastated city in recovery is not the sort of triumphant Renaissance history that past historians of Rome have been interested in. In other words, in order to tell one untold story, that of Central Mexicans in Rome in 1529, I've actually had to research and write another untold story, that of the urban recovery of Rome itself. Thus, writing a new history of Native Americans in Europe required me to simultaneously write a new history of Europe itself, focused on one of its most important cities, all of which means that bringing Rome and Mexico-Tenochtitlan Tlatelolco together in this project is not just an additive, combinatory strategy. It's a catalytic strategy, triggering new research on early modern Rome, which in turn made me rethink what I thought I knew about the early modern history of Mexico-Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco, as we'll see shortly. So those are some big picture introductions to the project, and now, part 2, Rome. So a key question for chapters 3 and 4 was, what was Rome like when the Nahuas visit in mid-April 1529? Again, this is about 2 years after the sack, 6 months after the Pope moved back. Chapter 3 sets up the Nahua visit by talking about the different ways that Rome was being rebuilt, again, from February 1528 to April 1529, so looking at churches and gardens and beards and bread, and then finally houses, which is what I'm going to focus on today. So there are a couple of famous estimates about the level of destruction in Rome, written in 1528. There's a spring 1528 diary, which says that 2/3 of Rome's houses were destroyed, and there's an October 7th, 1528 letter that says that 4/5 of the houses in Rome were uninhabitable. And these are roughly comparable statistics of devastation, 2/3 being 66% and 4/5 being 80%, which average out to 73%. And then comparably, there are two population estimates from early 1529 that claim the city's population was 25 to 30% of pre-sack levels. But of course, these kinds of early modern estimates always need to be taken very, very cautiously. And really, I mean, basically what I wanted to know was, would the Mesoamerican visitors have encountered visible ruination as they moved through the city in April 1529? Now, in micromaterial terms, so we're going from big general statistics, micromaterial practices, the destruction of Rome seems to have resulted, architecturally, seems to have resulted not only from burnings during the occupation, but also from the months of occupation of the city. So basic supply chains had broken down, of course, and over again, writers describe how the occupying troops supplied themselves with firewood by tearing out the wooden frames of house doors, wooden window frames, floor planks and ceiling beams, and burning them. And indeed, economic records 1520 to 1530 are filled with repairs of doors and windows. So it's not just complaints during the occupation, we actually see the economic implications of this once the occupation ends. Now, as it happens, Mesoamerican buildings also had doors with wooden lintels, painted red here, and Central Mexican historian James Lockhart points out that later in the 16th century, Nahua wills often included specific bequests for the inheritance of wooden door lintels, implying that these were highly worked, valuable parts of houses. And Matthew Restall has found the same door lintel inheritance practices among the early modern Maya of Yucatan. So in other words, the Central Mexican visitors to Rome would have noticed all the missing woodwork based on their own architectural traditions. So, first key resource for me for thinking in more focused terms about Rome's overall domestic architecture, 1528-1529, were the economic registers of the Spanish church in Rome, St. James or Santiago, centrally located on Piazza Navona. Sticky pages. The church archive is pretty amazing. It has month-by-month, year-by-year economic records from 1486 to 1803. There are 4 volumes missing, so basically over 300 years of year-by-year economic records. These books record rental information and also the money spent by the church for house upkeep. And there's also a 17th century map of these properties, many of which had been owned since the 16th century, so we can figure out more or less where these are on the ground. And basically, each year in this archive has a separate book. So there's a sample cover over here, highlighted from 1532. In these books, each rental property has a separate page, sample page over there. The name of the renter appears at the top, where the house is, the second line, what the overall annual rent is in the margin, and then the rest of the page indicates amounts paid, usually in two payments. Although in this case, there were 3 payments of 1, 7, and 7 ducats, which add up to just over 15 ducats, which is the annual rent. Not surprisingly, again, this is 1532. In 1527, very few rents are paid for the second half of the year. And then from 1528 on, and here's actually 1528 here, many rents are not paid at all. And from 1528, we see that many houses are empty and then get new owners. So I've focused on 15 years, 1519 to 1533, during which the church owned about 50 rental properties. And since these 15 years involve thousands of pages, I've reduced them to an Excel chart to get a synoptic picture, which some of you may have major problems with, but we have a Q&A at the end. But overall, so a white cell is rent that's fully paid, a pale gray cell is a rent that's partially paid, dark gray cell, no rent paid, black cell indicates a house is in ruins or unrentable, and then dark red text in italic indicates a change of tenant, and then 1529 is the column highlighted in yellow for reference. Overall, what this synoptic view reveals is a fifth of the properties owned by the Spanish Church in Rome were so badly damaged during the sack and occupation of the city that they had to be totally rebuilt. Another 16 properties needed expensive repairs in the years from 1528 to 1530, so new walls, roofs, doors, windows, as well as internal garbage removal. Overall then, half of the properties of the Church of St. James of the Spaniard were damaged during the tragic events of 1527-28. And there are also major changes in rent non-payments and my being taken away, and changes in occupants in the years before 1527 versus the years afterwards. Again, pale gray versus darker gray and dark red text. So we'll map these results in just a minute, but first let's look at two other alphabetic architectural sources. So the Archconfraternity of the Gonfalone also owned rental properties, and these economic records are now in the Vatican archives. They document over 100 rental properties throughout the city. Unfortunately, as you can see over here, the surviving account books have a number of gaps, but fortunately I can still span the 1513 to 1532 15 years that I do for the rental properties of St. James. The Gonfalone rental properties organize properties by neighborhood, which you see over here. Vertical column on the left. For our purposes here, the most interesting year-by-year statistics for making pre versus post-sack comparisons are A, rentable building spaces, which is the first number in each cell, B, unpaid rents for the properties, second number, and C, properties listed as ruins, which is the third number in each cell, and there are year-by-year totals across the bottom. Now, as you can see, two buildings are already listed as being in ruins before the sack, and curiously, non-payment levels are already pretty high before 1527. These are both things that contrast with the rental houses for the properties of St. James, which are actually all at a higher price point, so we have a very different kind of renter for these houses. In the combined account book for 1529-30, 17 properties are listed as ruins or ruins recently repaired. Two of those buildings, again, had been ruined before the sack, which means that 13% of the Archconfraternity's rental properties were heavily damaged in 1527. Unfortunately, we don't have account books for 1527 or 1528, so it's hard to know how many properties were partially damaged during the sack and occupation, so only needed new doors, new windows, cleaning to make them habitable again, which again is something we can see for the economic records of the Church of St. James. So they're parallel but not totally comparable economic documents of rental properties. But again, for me the important question is, what buildings are visibly ruined in April 1529? Finally, as a third alphabetic architectural source, in 2023, Orietta Verdi published a great essay on sales contracts in the account books of the notary for Rome's street captains, and these are in Rome's Archivio di Stato, and she documents over 40 houses, still described as still in ruins, from April 1529 all the way to December 1533. Now, creating a complete map of ruined houses in the post-sack city is going to be impossible. But with these three sources, I'm able to document over 200 properties of Rome, and then at the start of chapter 4, I combine this documentation, described at the end of chapter 3, discussed at the end of chapter 3, with the basic routes the Nahuas would have taken through Rome in April 1529, from their arrival to their housing to the multi-step, multi-site process of petitioning and producing papal bulls. So as I mentioned at the start, papal documents could be requested in absentia by a representative. Again, Cortez is granted 3 papal bulls at this time, but he doesn't go to Rome. He has a conquistador representative go to Rome for him. Crucially, a close reading of the texts of both the supplication and then the bulls finally granted for the Nahua churches makes very clear in its linguistic details that the Nahua pilgrims in Rome were not just sitting around in their hotel room. They were actively involved in the writing first of the supplication, draft on paper, and then in the writing of the final bulls on parchment. But again, to keep this on 40 minutes, those document details can't be discussed today. But in terms of the big picture, the Mesoamericans would have arrived at the Ripa port on the Tiber. If they took the ancient Roman Aemilian Bridge or the 2 adjacent Tiber Island hopping bridges, they would have walked by Rome's Jewish district and then passed through a zone heavily damaged, still heavily damaged for 1527, and then finally arriving at the central market plaza of Field of Flowers, on which was still another sacked, ruined house. And this is adjacent to the Chancellery Palace, which is home to Vatican bureaucratic offices, and this is also where the Spanish ambassador lived. So this could be one of the places the Nahuas actually stayed during probably their 10-day visit to Rome. Now, alternatively, by walking from Ripa 15 minutes to the northwest, they would have arrived at the plaza at the Church of Holy Mary in Trastevere, there encountering at least one house still roofless and doorless from the sack. They would have then crossed the Sistine Bridge, limited bridges across the Tiber at this point in time, this bridge is important, and then continued through the ruin zone and eventually ending up at Field of Flowers. As I said, they may have stayed at the Chancellery Palace. Another option was the Inn for Pilgrims that was maintained by the Church of St. James on Piazza Navona, and they certainly visited this church. Now to get there from the Chancellery Palace, they passed through another heavily damaged zone, 3 ruined buildings facing the palace on their left, and the 3 ruined buildings of the Massimo family palace, soon to be rebuilt, on their right. To get to the Vatican from this central area, they probably took the Street of the Pilgrims to the Sant'Angelo Bridge, passing by at least 4 more houses still ruined from the sack. So having crossed the bridge, they continued on to St. Peter's in the Vatican in order to meet the Pope and be granted approval for the papal bulls in support of these specific churches back home. They would have started this bull production process with an audience in the Vatican Palace, and this audience is later described by both Paolo Giovio and Bernal Diaz. From the Vatican Palace, they would have headed next door to the Papal Office Building, the now vanished Palace of Innocent VIII, for initial document registration. Then they would have had to cross back over the Tiber and gone to the Chancellery Palace, there to have the bulls actually written up on parchment, again, in an object something like this. Then they had to return to the Vatican Palace again to have the parchments blessed by the Pope. And then finally, they headed back to the Palace of Innocent VII Office Building to have lead seals like this attached to the documents, and then for final registration. So the dozen ruined buildings I just mentioned along probable Nahua routes through the city are not the only buildings in Rome I can document. In 1529 they're still ruined, other ruins are in other parts of the city. And of course here I'm working with like a handful of sources. There are surely dozens of other ruined buildings still visibly ruined in Rome that the Nahuas would have seen, for which we just don't have records. But back to my starting questions for chapter 4. Were there still ruined buildings in Rome in mid-April 1529? Yes. Would the Nahuas have seen any of them? Almost certainly. Part 3, Mexico-Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco. This brings us to chapter 5, and again, it begins in Seville with preparations to sail west across the Atlantic in the summer and fall of 1529. And then the rest of the chapter travels to Mesoamerica to kind of visit the 4 communities granted papal bulls in Rome and talk about what they were like spatially in 1529, as well as what we know about their papally recognized churches. So for instance, Fort Tlaxcala, we have great recent archaeological survey and excavation work. The city was built on terraces on a series of hills at the confluence of 2 rivers. Colhuacan was built on an artificial island in Lake Texcoco. Here's a famous map of the Valley of Mexico created around 1540. North is to the right, and here's where Colhuacan is. Zoom in, and here's this artificial island. And again, we've got great archaeological survey work before the explosion of Mexico City's urbanism done in the 70s, and also more recent documentation of surviving pre-Hispanic remains in Colhuacan today. And then finally, Mexico-Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco shared the largest artificial island in Lake Texcoco, Mexico-Tenochtitlan to the south, Tlatelolco to the north. Here is the island footprint map we looked at earlier. Again, the island is about 2.5 miles north to south, 2 miles east to west. It's big. It was covered with mostly 1-story plastered adobe buildings, plus temple-filled ceremonial centers in the center of Mexico-Tenochtitlan and in the center of Tlatelolco, and Tlatelolco also had a giant market plaza that is super famous. And all of these basic features actually appear in this 1524 woodcut that is the talk's poster, and a woodcut that Barbara Mundy, in a still genius article, argued is the woodcut is based probably on an actual Nahua pre-Hispanic or early 16th century or early 1520s map of the island. So when I started to think about the Mexico-Tenochtitlan Tlatelolco sections of chapter 5, I had to think about what the island was like physically and architecturally in 1529, which again is less than a decade after the surrender of the Aztec Emperor Cuauhtémoc to Hernando Cortés on August 13th, August 13th, 1521. So we know the whole island is ordered depopulated in the fall of 1521. This seems to be the Emperor Cuauhtémoc's idea because of disease and the aqueducts had been cut and food shortages. However, the following spring, 1522, the Tlatelolcans are allowed to return to their northern part of the island, and the white line is a canal that formerly separated Tlatelolco to the north from Mexico-Tenochtitlan to the south. So the Tlatelolcans are back spring 1522, and then 2 years later, spring 1524, both Nahuas and Spaniards return to Mexico-Tenochtitlan on the lower part of the island. And again, the Spaniards occupying this 13 by 13 block traza surrounding the old Aztec ceremonial center. Again, the traza takes up about a quarter of the city. The rest of the island is Nahua territory. So when I first started to imagine what the island was like when people started to move back, first in the spring of 1522 and then in the spring of 1524, I had in my mind an image of a uniform field of rubble, a total blank slate that had to be 100% rebuilt from scratch. But the more I thought about it, lots of questions came up. The island's big, it's like almost 5 square miles. The Spaniards did have 3 large cannons and 15 smaller field guns, but a cannonball could basically take out 1 building at a time. And Cortés reports all the problems that the Spaniards had with the cannons. They're bulky, the Spaniards have to abandon some of them mid-battle, and then the cannons are captured by the Nahuas and dumped in the lake. So it's like classic story of gunpowder. Like, it's not as fancy as everybody seems to think it was in the past. So I came to realize that my image of the island as a blank slate after 1521 was partially influenced by images of firebombed European cities after World War II, bombed by the air with thousands of bombs that exploded on impact, destroying many buildings at once and starting fires. This is firepower that Cortez's cannons just didn't have. And of course, Lucia has written brilliantly about aerial firebombing as a radically new military strategy in the 1930s and 40s. And Danny Marcus has pointed out how this shocking novelty was key to the force of Picasso's Guernica. Also, unlike early modern London, mostly destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666, Tenochtitlan was not a very flammable city. Plastered adobe doesn't burn. House roofs were flat, not covered with thatch. Roofs were made out of wooden beams, but that was plastered over, so that would have been a fire retardant. And indeed, here's a newspaper article from 2024 about a revival of adobe anti-wildfire construction in the western part of the US. Dirt doesn't burn. So I then realized further that my image of Mexico-Tenochtitlan as a field of rubble after 1521 was not just based on images of cities after World War II, but also on the letters written by Conquistador Hernando Cortés. Again, more alphabetic architecture. So these are extremely long letters written to Carlos, King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, letters designed to justify Cortés's military campaign, which even in Spanish terms at the time was an illegal invasion. So Cortés's letters are extremely strategic and calculated. The final military campaign against Mexico-Tenochtitlan in 1521 is described in Cortés's 3rd letter, which is finished May 15th, 1522, so not quite a half a year afterwards, finished in Coyoacán, which is now in southern Mexico City, but which was then on the mainland shores of Lake Texcoco. Remember, Mexico-Tenochtitlan is still abandoned in May 1522 when Cortés is finishing this letter, but Tlatelolco, northern part of the island, is being resettled at this time. So let's start with some of Cortés's post-conquest descriptions of the Aztec capital after Emperor Cuauhtémoc's surrender. Cortés writes that we destroyed and razed the city, the destruction and razing of the city of Tenochtitlan. Earlier, writing of his military campaign against Mexico-Tenochtitlan, Cortez writes how his Nahua military allies burned and tore down the houses, how along a main north-south street they did nothing but burn and tear down houses, burn and destroy. And even earlier, talking of his military strategies against other cities, Cortez describes the destruction and razing of a large town, and another 3-day assault in which left another city completely burned and razed. So as you can see, Cortez's accounts of urban warfare against Tenochtitlan and other cities have a very strange poetics. He uses basically 4 words, destroy, tear down, raze, burn, in a series of paired combinations. So I thought these quasi-poetic features were very curious, and I started to do some research, and this brought me to early modern Spanish translations of Titus Livy's History of Ancient Rome, and here we see the same rhetorical strategies we see in Cortez's descriptions of urban warfare. A very limited vocabulary, destroy, tear down, rob, burn, repeatedly combined in paired phrasings. Now significantly, the first published translation of Livy into Spanish was printed in Salamanca in 1497, and Cortez begins university at Salamanca 2 years later in 1499. So he could have easily encountered the first edition, and in any case, other reprintings followed. So basically I came to realize, again, on this theme of architecture and alphabetic sources, that my vision of the island of Tenochtitlan, Tlatelolco, as this 5-square-mile field of rubble in 1521, was deeply shaped by Cortez's claims in his letters, which we should not interpret as factual description, but rather as literary allusions to Livy and ancient Roman warfare. That we would see a stylistic connection linking Livy and Cortez is actually not surprising at all. Manuel Alcalá, in his César y Cortés, studies the use not only of Latin quotations in Cortez's writings, but amazingly, the influence of Latin grammatical constructions on Cortez's writing style in Castilian. Totally amazing. Also, famously, David Luffer's Romans in a New World talks about the major influence of ancient Roman models in the writings of the conquistadors. So in contrast to these sweeping military poetics of total devastation, if we turn back to Cortez's letters on the siege of Tenochtitlan from May to August 1521 and read them carefully, a focused military architectural strategy seems to emerge, and not an effort to reduce the entire island to a field of rubble. So, buildings on the island's shores were targeted by boat. Within the urban footprint, military action aimed at taking control of a few key corridors. First, the north-south corridor that ran from a southern causeway across the lake up to the ceremonial center of Mexico-Tenochtitlan, and then an east-west corridor that connected the market and ceremonial center of Tlatelolco to a western causeway across the lake. The 1521 summer of warfare against the island involved almost daily skirmishes along these arteries and their adjacent plazas. Crucially, the invaders retreat at night, which allows the locals to put up barricades again and then fill in the canals, which the invaders had filled with rubble so that their horses could ride over them. So it's this constant day-to-day tearing stuff down, back and forth. It's not until significantly the feast day of Santiago of St. James on July 25th, so this is 3 weeks before Cuauhtémoc's surrender on August 13th, that Cortez narrates his orders to systematically destroy houses along the main north-south avenue, in part because the flat roofs were being used by Aztec snipers to attack invaders on the avenue below. But even raising these limited north-south blocks would not have been easy, given available technology. Cortez mentions a dozen men with picks, presumably European iron tools, as well as the use by Nahua allies of coas, which are wooden digging sticks, to hack away at earthworks and adobe buildings. And FYI, there are 2 marvelous studies of the plaster used in the ceremonial center of pre-Hispanic Tenochtitlan. This was a high-quality plaster imported long distance from Tula, although this plaster is for sacred and not domestic architecture. Again, there's a lack of evidence, archaeological evidence, for domestic architecture on the island in the 1520s. But I was like, this is going to be catnip to this audience. Plaster studies from 500 years ago. So in sum, my vision of the island after 1521 has changed from being a field of rubble to being a ghost town, filled with mostly intact buildings left abandoned in the fall of 1521, although with heavy scars of damage along major avenues. Remember, the Tlatelolcans returned to their city in the spring of 1522, less than a year after Cuauhtémoc's surrender. Their abandoned houses would have in need of cleaning and repair, but not total rebuilding. And even when the inhabitants of Mexico-Tenochtitlan returned 2 years later, that was hardly enough time to reduce plastered adobe buildings to mud. Now, of course, the Nahuas whose homes had been in the 13 by 13 block area that the Spanish claimed as the Traza would have had to find new homes. But even the Spanish city was very much in construction in the second half of the 1520s. So, as Angel Rama and Helen Nader and Tom Cummins have all argued, early modern Spanish urbanism could be a very bureaucratic affair. A Spanish city could be called into existence by electing city officials long before any buildings were built on the ground. The creation of the Spanish city in the middle of Mexico-Tenochtitlan seems to have begun in Coyoacán in 1522 or 23 with the drawing of an urban plan on paper of what the future Spanish city would look like. The urban plan was called a traza, which is the exact same word used for the grid of streets eventually built. So there's a nice overlapping between the plan and the actual built city. It seems that Spaniards were assigned house lots on this paper traza first, and then that information was entered into the minute books of the Spanish city council meetings, but not always. So here is a useful example from the Spanish city council minutes from July 31st, 1527. I've just highlighted the key points. Andrés de Barrios wants his title to a house lot in the Spanish city to be declared anew. And again, it's next to the monastery of St. Dominic, Santo Domingo. And this repeat declaration is needed because his grant is registered on the Traza map, but not in the minute books of the Spanish City Council. And here is another great example describing the Traza as an urban plan on a piece of paper. City Council meetings, July 18, 1529. Hernando Perez wants to become a citizen, a vecino of the Spanish city, and so the Traza map needs to be brought out so that a house lot can be assigned to him. Now, the individual assignation of specific house lots in the overall urban plan of the Traza is really important for imagining how the Spanish city comes into being on the ground. The main grid of streets of the Spanish city was probably hacked through the adobe buildings of the Aztec ghost town in late 1523 or early 1524. That's the grid of streets. The clearing of individual house lots within that street grid and the building of new Spanish-style buildings was in the hands of individual Spanish property owners, who, on being granted a house lot on the paper plan, then had officially 6 months to demarc and clear their individual house lot. I'm not going to read these, but they talk about this process of delimiting, cercado, and also cleaning, limpio, these individual house lots. So again, on the right is a map of the Traza plotting the house lots document is granted from 1524 to 1534. This was plotted by Valero de Garcia Lascurain in 1991, based on the acts of the Mexico City Town Council from the spring of 1524 to 1534. As we just saw, details of exactly where individual house lots in these city council meeting minutes are often vague. It's by St. Dominic, for example. So the specific plotting of house lots here is probably a little imprecise. The important thing is the overall vision of documented house lots within the overall grid. As you can see, less than half of the house lots in the grid had been assigned to owners by 1534, and of course I need to do a new version of this that only covers house lots granted up to 1529 when the Nahua Ambassadors return, or 1530. So basically, within the Spanish city, we need to think of a process of excavating the spaces of a new Spanish city from out of the adobe structures of the old Aztec city that still covered most of the island. This would have been a weirdly sculptural process of clearing this irregular checkerboard of new lots, lot by lots, from out of the Aztec ghost town, producing a bizarre visual and spatial palimpsest of old city and then new city. But crucially, remember, the Spanish city only took up a quarter of the island. The rest of the island was Nahua territory. And the acts of the Spanish Town Council for the Spanish city of Mexico City make clear that Spaniards who tried to build in lots outside of the Traza were made to abandon those extra Traza house lots, and so maintain a very clear separation of Spanish city and Nahua neighborhoods. So those are some thoughts on architectural history, Reconstruction, and alphabetic sources. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Byron, for the presentation of this incredible wealth of research that you've presented for us today, and also many thanks to Lucia for the invitation and for initiating this series of encounters within the framework of the Buell Center's mission. I'm going to take two cues, basically, one from Byron's talk and one from Lucia's framing of the series. This is just from the description on the website of the Encounters series. The first question, and I'm just going to, there are two questions that introduce this series, actually, and I'm just going to take the first one. What happens when you detach the study of American architecture, the Buell Center's founding mission, from the inherited temporalities of United States national history, periodized as it tends to be by the fundamental rupture of the American Revolution? And the prompt that I'll take from Byron's talk this afternoon is his suggestion, actually his demonstration of the catalytic strategy, that posing one question about an encounter within what he calls the Mediterratlantic world, it catalyzes a new investigation, an unexpected investigation about European architectural history, namely the rebuilding of Rome in post-1527. So I'm going to try and take that catalysis and very irresponsibly and not grounded in the archives, move us to the date of the American Revolution to see if I can get us to or past 1776 in 4 images. So as Lucia said, Byron's work is a perfect place to begin this kind of investigation because he has been advocating and demonstrating for 20 years now the productive capacity of a Mediterratlantic frame for studying, in particular, the architectural histories, art histories, cultural histories, anthropologies of the 16th century, and especially within the Kingdom of Spain. Lucia mentioned the wonderful book, Bad Christians, New Spains, which is an extended demonstration of the productive comparison of 2 inquisitorial trials from the 1540s, one that takes place in Valencia and one that takes place in Oaxaca, and how setting these side by side demonstrates the kind of interrelated nature of this world, single world, and this is a crucial claim, I think, in that book, that you cannot speak about a colonial Latin America and a Spain in the 1540s. It is simply a Kingdom of Spain that embraces all of those, in which, of course, there are tremendous axes of power inscribed and imbalances between centers and multiple peripheries. But that ultimately, and this is, I think, in some ways the most provocative claim of this book, of Bad Christians, New Spains, we can't read the colonial dynamics of the 18th and 19th century back into the encounters of the 16th century. And especially when we tell that story on the basis of archival sources, what we had, as opposed to sort of synthetic secondary studies that launched the global turn in early modern studies, that you get a very different and highly nuanced sort of image. And Byron follows through then in the subsequent book, the Invention of the Colonial Americas, by locating this point of transition really around the year 1800. And it's either side of the year 1800. And for him, the exemplary case study is the construction of an archive in Seville that sort of reifies the notion of a colonial Latin America as a distinct world from the Kingdom of Spain. So that's already a kind of a preview, in a way, of the strategy that he's using in this particular study. But it's interesting to me how the change in the archives has necessitated methodological changes in the work that you've presented here today. So in that study, you're comparing 2 very similar documents, these 2 basically 400-page manuscripts of the inquisitorial proceedings. And that is the sort of the structure of the comparison, is that you have these 2 comparable documents. Here you're posing a question that requires you to move beyond the bounds of the strictly archival. And to, in a sense, construct or to interpolate archives that don't exist or that are far more fragmentary. In other words, in this case, it's much more question-driven, that the question is coming first, and then you're seeking as much as you can the data, both visual and archival, that will allow you to answer it. And you're also, and I think this is quite important, are moving outside of the strictly Kingdom of Spain context. In Tenochtitlan, we're still very firmly within the expansion of Charles V as King of Spain. As soon as we get into Italy and Rome in this period, we're dealing with a much more complicated set of questions about the Holy Roman Empire and a different claim to sovereignty that Charles V is establishing. So I'm just going to try and pitch even further against the historical, methodological, and geographical boundaries, and to see if I can get us as far as I said to 1800 and to a North American denouement in this story, which would be in part an attempt to challenge the idea that the world really does change radically around the year 1800. That's my other sort of provocation here, is whether we can take this catalysis that you're initiating in the 16th century and really push it into reframing the way that we think about the 18th and 19th centuries also. So I always begin in Constantinople, and it's so striking to me that we have a document of Constantinople that is in many ways strictly analogous to the Pinard view of Rome that you were using, and also to the Nuremberg woodcut of Tenochtitlan. This is also a 16th century print, based, it seems like, as in the case of the Tenochtitlan map, on some earlier, more accurate sources that were probably produced around the year 1480. And so for me, one of the first provocations of Byron's talk was to think about this as a document, not just the way in which I've sort of been trained to use it as a historian of Byzantine architecture, that's as a sort of imperfect document of the Byzantine fabric of the city, but actually as also potentially a document of the conquest and sack of Constantinople in 1453, an earlier sack. That sack has been compared to the conquest of Tenochtitlan quite recently. There's a prominent study by Eleni Kefala that thinks about the rhetoric of loss of the city in these sort of laments for the lost city that are composed after the sack. This gives us a very different picture, not of a lost city, very much in the way that you described in terms of Tenochtitlan. The image here is also telling us a lot about what remains, and simultaneously about the production of an idea of antiquity, distinctions between things that were there before and things that were there afterwards. It also does provide us with the opportunity to sort of read archival sources against a visual source like this, to try and plot archival sources. There's a little neighborhood up there that's marked as San Andrea, the monastery of San Andrea. That, for example, is something that we can identify in a survey of the city that was conducted immediately after the conquest in 1453, where there's a description of the Sultan's man going door to door and documenting who lives in this place, how many of these buildings are ruined, so on and so forth. And when I've tried to sort of bring those two sources into conversation with each other, I've always run up against a kind of friction, that there's a point at which I can no longer identify the house that belongs to Yorgo of Edirne, who is no longer there, but his brother has taken up residence, the sorts of things that are inscribed in the archive. That's to say, I reach a point of resolution. So where it gets too low res for me to see the specifics of the archives. And so that's one methodological question that I have. Is it always so frictionless as you've presented in your talk, where you're able to identify the ruined house that is named in the rent ledger on the Pinard map? Because it's extremely impressive when you're able to really make that connection. Also, in terms of thinking about the other documents of ruins and ways that we can think about them differently, Byron's talk is based very much in the late 1520s and 1530s, in this period of Reconstruction. And this happens to be the same date of an extraordinary series of sketches that were executed by a Dutch artist named Martin van Heemskerk, who took up residence in Rome precisely during this period. These are also among the most prominent sort of documents that are used by historians of ancient Roman architecture to try and reconstruct the ancient view of the city. And Byron's talk really makes me wonder whether we can't also read them as documents of a post-Sack city, of a much more recent and catastrophic sort of process than we are accustomed to assume. So for example, if you look at this view of the Roman Forum with these columns that have been lined up curiously, maybe are serving as a bench, or I can't tell, possibly those individuals are pushing them. Is this part of the despoliation of ruins in order to reconstruct, for example, in the aftermath? The kinds of despoliation that you're describing that are attested during Charles V's troops' stay within the city. So here, a sack that also produces, in a way, a kind of a production of an idea of antiquity. That's image number 2. I want to move us now forward in time and back into the Ottoman world with an image from the 18th century. From Stewart and Revet's Antiquities of Athens. So this was an image, again, that was produced in the 1750s by 2 English draftsmen who were funded in an importantly Mediterratlantic aspect of the story by a man named James Dawkins, who was a Jamaica plantation owner, the owner of a number of enslaved persons in the British colony of Jamaica, tremendously wealthy, and he funded these various expeditions, including Stewart and Revet's, to the Eastern Mediterranean, to the Ottoman world, in order to recover documents of ancient, in this case Greek, architecture. So that you get, again, views that are testimonies both to a kind of a production of antiquity, but also to a much more recent conquest, because, of course, in this case, the fact that the Parthenon is missing its roof, and that the new, much smaller mosque has been built inside of it, is not a longue durée process of entropy or of ruination. That's the result of the Venetian bombardment of the city in the previous century, at which point the Parthenon was shelled and lost its roof. So there's a kind of a production of antiquity happening out of the moment of conquest. Image number 4, strictly formal comparison, but I think indisputable, bringing us into the world of the new USA, that's to say the early 19th century, and the production, again, of a sort of an idea of antiquity after a moment of conquest. And in particular, when I think about this as a Mediterratlantic document, as opposed to a document in the history of colonial or early American architecture, one of the questions that I ask is, what is the kind of compensatory function that the construction of a building like this in Philadelphia has in terms of building a new Athens once the old Athens has been to some degree lost? So it makes me wonder whether here, too, it's possible to continue the kind of story of exchange that you're telling into the North American context and into the early 19th century. Those are many more questions than I would expect answers to. I just want to express my gratitude for what you've shared with us, and I'm really curious also to hear how other people take the provocations that you've given us today. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Byron, do you want to do some?
Sure. Well, I fear that the image of the Pinar map has made it seem like I'm able to be much more precise than I can. Basically, the X's are for when we know there's so many houses on this particular street, or the houses are in front of this building, or the house is on this particular plaza. So it's so again, the map's from like the 1550s. So the idea is this is kind of keying in how the records describe where houses are. There's another set of rental properties that are owned by the Vatican, but those rental properties, at least for the late 1520s, are not very specific in terms of how they identify houses. Like with the Gonfalone and the Spanish Church in Rome, house locations are, specific in terms of on this plaza, on this street. There's very little of that in the, weirdly, for the Vatican economic records. So those have been left aside precisely because they don't let me approximate even what I can do. So that's partially an effect of just the graphics. The Heemskerk stuff is very interesting. As far as I've gotten with it, So obviously, so one of the things I am interested in is obviously this image of the old St. Peter's being built, being partially destroyed, and the new St. Peter's around it. What is much as the opening at the Butterfly House, how would Nahuas have imagined Rome? Also thinking about what kinds of reactions would they have had to the urbanism of Rome based on these pre-Hispanic traditions. The idea of building newer temples around older temples is totally pre-Hispanic. Totally, this is of course the Great Temple in Mexico City, which has layer upon layer of pyramid being built in an ever increasing size. So thinking about the Heemskirk versions in this kind of not as a ruin, but a construction work in situ. There's a guy, Di Furia, whose first name I forget, who's done a Heemskirk in Ruins monograph. He talks sort of generally metaphorically about ruins, but doesn't link anything to the sack of the city. But this is a nice prompt that I should re-look at those, especially since in the past year I've been looking at this, on this plaza there's supposed to be something, on this street there's supposed to be something. So that could be an interesting way to return to those Heemskirk images. I totally love the woodcut of Constantinople, maybe based on a 1480 source, is parallel to a Barbara Mundi. Has anybody written that up?
I mean, that's how it exists in the archive, but the idea has not been developed.
Wow, that sounds like a pretty marvelous,
You heard it here first.
sequel. Let's see. Where, I think I have to go way back. No, I don't think I have to go way back to get there. Here we go. Let's see. Mapping the Ottoman capital, the something. Anyway, you can imagine just reframing the title, and that's super exciting. We'll have to talk more about
AI
this.
who is listening is writing.
Is already writing.
Oh my God! Well, I want co-author credit then, AI. I think those are some, and indeed, the general comments early on method in Bad Christians were two totally parallel documents versus this one where the alphabetic sources are irregular is absolutely what I was kind of trying to wrestle with for the project. I guess those are some, and I'm going to have to visit this Bank of the U.S. Second Bank of the U.S. in Philadelphia since I'm there that spring. I guess those are some initial responses. I don't know how we're doing for time.
Yeah, we could maybe take some questions from the room. Lisa looks like she has one, and then Michael.
I'll stand up because I'm a bit short. It was really wonderful to hear this pair of the paper and the respondent, so congrats to everyone, especially the chief for putting this together. Byron, I was really interested to hear in your comments just now thoughts on Nahua reception of Roman antiquity and thinking about the episodic rebuilding of the Templo Mayor is one way to think about it, certainly. But I wonder what you think. I'm sure you don't have a document that would speak to this, but if I could ask you to extrapolate or to fabulate even on what the Nahua reception might have been of ancient Rome, so not just the sacked Rome, but the more ancient ruins of Rome, within the framework of what we know, especially I'm thinking of Emily Umberger's excellent work on Aztec antiquarianism. I'm sure you know the piece in Res. How the Nahua's reception of ancient Rome might have been informed by their own Nahuatl ideas around antiquity and the claiming or even sometimes the appropriation of non-Tenochtitlan, non-Tlaxcala sites like Teotihuacan, like Xochimilco? Yeah, like Tula, Hidalgo, where they are pointing to these sort of mythical ancestors that they are placing within these ancient places, the Toltecs, as their own ancestors, that they probably weren't, as the originators of everything good and beautiful. And so how that might map on to a Nahua experience of Rome in this moment, either as perhaps the Iberians and the Italians own Toulon, or maybe there's a sense of a kind of global, I don't want to use the word heritage, but something like that, like a global belonging there where Rome might be another Teotihuacan. So that's a long question for you. Thank you.
Great. So obviously the first thing everybody should read in the room, if you haven't already, is Andrew Laird's recent book called Aztec Latin, which is all about, he's a classicist at Brown, but interested in Latin in the Americas, and it's all about how the Nahuas are learning Latin in these Franciscan missionary contexts and translating stuff and all sorts of, like Aesop's fables, which in the past has been interpreted as an unspoiled vision of Nahuas rewriting Aesop's fables. That's just because we have the edition wrong that they're translating, and it's in fact a brilliant, a very precise translation of Aesop's fables from Latin into Nahua. So that's a general frame. This question, so I mentioned the kind of this experimental thinking of how would the Nahuas have encountered this city. Something I've pondered a lot. The ruins we talked about earlier. There's also, I will get to your very specific comment in just a second. There's also, in the patio in front of St. Peter's, there's this crazy monument right here, which is columns. And inside there's a giant pine cone out of bronze, which used to be a fountain, flanked by, originally the peacocks were up on the roof. So this was in front of the old St. Peter's. Of course, the peacocks would have been green, long feathered birds, so we think of these as quetzales. And then this, of course, would strike them as a giant maize cob, right, made out of greenstone. So thinking about that kind of interpretation. Bathhouse culture is apparently also super important in Rome, and it's in 16th century Rome as a revival of classical antiquities. So there's the Stufetta at the Vatican, and there's a charming Losana, the lusty Andalusian girl, who it's a play written in Rome before the sack, and then it's published in Venice after the sack, and it's constantly talking about bathhouse culture in Rome. And of course, bathing is a key Mesoamerican, sweat bath bathing, right? I haven't found if sweat baths actually are reopened in Rome by the time of the visit. So I've been thinking on this broadly. For the antiquarian connection, this is one of the things I couldn't talk about meanings of churches. So so a perfect question, thank you very much. So
Not about planted.
So the church for Culhuacan, which again is this artificial island in the lake, is the bull is requested for a church of St. John the Baptist and the Evangelist. There is, decades later, we know that at Culhuacan, the main church is dedicated to St. John the Baptist, but there's a separate church to St. John the Evangelist. So the bull authorizes a single church dedicated to both saints. In practice, that doesn't seem to happen on the ground, so the bull is kind of an aspirational thing. So I was thinking about this, and of course there is a major church in Rome dedicated to both St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist, which is St. John Lateran. And if we do a kind of fantasy thinking about that, I mean, St. John Lateran at the time was in a cow field way outside of the center, long hike from the center, much as Culhuacan is this is not to scale, but a substantial canoe ride from the center of Tenochtitlan. There's a great Heemskirk image of what St. John Lateran is like. Well, St. John's Lateran. So there's the Marcus Aurelius statue is there. There are tons of old columns that are there. There are the sacred stairs that have supposedly been brought from Jerusalem, right, from Pontius Pilate's house. And then there are a bunch of ancient Egyptian lion sculptures, which surely would have been interest to Mesoamericans, given the importance of giant felines in there. So I kind of was wondering, I mean, my fantasy precisely is, why do we request this for the two St. Johns? That doesn't happen in practice. Was there a visiting there? Was there an interest in its spatial relation to the center of the city? Is there an interest in the archaeology that was there of ancient Egyptian stuff and ancient Roman stuff? There are also two medieval lions. So that would be at a place in the city, again, partially, connected to one of the papal bulls possibly, where this kind of archaeological thinking might have been engaged with. That's my main kind of thinking about how Nahua traditions of archaeology might have been activated through the trip and how it might actually be registered in terms of a document. Is that what that's like as adjacent as I have? Is that not right what you wanted, or?
I mean, I don't think that my question has an answer beyond pure speculation, which I find to be useful. I think my question is operating more at the level of what is an ancient place, of the concept of what is an ancient place. But we can move on. Someone else. We can move on.
I mean,
Like, do they experience it as a place with two times?
so the Forum is basically the edge of the city at that point. Would they? The Forum's being sort of looted for stone, but as we saw, it's we can imagine them being at the Forum and not being, thinking about Teotihuacan, for example, right? Roughly analogously. So that is one zone of the city with unoccupied at this point, with kind of fragmentary architecture. St. John Lateran is kind of one of the places in the city where you can publicly see ancient statuary. This is, of course, the 1520s. There's evidence in the papal bulls that at least one of them knew Latin by this point, and they're probably speaking in Spanish as well. But how that would let us think about what sorts of ancient Latin engagements they might have had in the city. This I don't know. So I guess that's as good as I can do right now. But I've taken notes. So.
Yes. First of all, thank you. Coming to this as an Italianist, it's a completely new and provocative perspective on what the way people talk about Romans. Two questions, and maybe there are variations on questions that have already been asked. First is, when Italianists think of what Rome was like after the sack, they don't imagine images like the photograph of the fire-bound city. They imagine precisely Haynes Kirk and those drawings, which are regularly described as specifically images of post-sack Rome. And you can find this in the work of Christoph Tonis and in the exhibition of Haynes Kirk in Berlin from last year, as well as they also think of the many other images of cities and ruins that people made both in Rome and in other cities with artists who were often in exile because they left the city because of the sack. So there is an extensive visual culture of ruination associated with Rome in the 1530s, and I just wonder how that compares to the visual documentation. I mean, the textual documentation that you primarily rely on. Do these things align, or do they somehow show different things? And I guess the other thing is even if Rome hadn't been sacked in 1527, it was already a city of ruins, and it was already a city that had been dramatically depopulated, and it was a city that was that way both in reality and in its regular descriptions. Titus Livy is part of that. He tells us to imagine this city that's been destroyed, right? So I'm wondering, for someone who's traveling from a place where there is, at least from the Spanish side, already an imagination of Rome that's informed by writers like Titus Livy, through Spain to Rome, wouldn't that person already have imagined Rome as a ruined city? And what would the actual encounter with the city after the sack have? What would have been surprising?
So, in terms of why the Nahuas decided to go, part of what I do is think about, adjacent to this, the circulation of papal documents in Mexico, in the Valley of Mexico for 1520. So there are like a half dozen references to papal bulls already circulating through the city. So for thinking about how the Nahuas would have imagined the city, again, speaking aloud, imagining them thinking about it as a source where the head of this new religion is issuing documents on animal skin, which is of course a pre-Hispanic medium as well. Mesoamerican people have been doing long-distance diplomatic connections for thousands of years. This is a much longer one, but it's not a radically different idea to have an embassy far away where people speak different languages. So that is, again, thinking specifically about how the Nahuas would have imagined Rome. That is, I had not thought about whether they would already be imagining Rome as this ancient place, as opposed to as like an ancient antique pagan place, as opposed to a papal Catholic kind of place. So that is as much as I can do on that question. With you're gonna have to send me later the Christoph reference, which I don't know the online exhibit. I do know. The curious thing with the Heemskerk is Rome in ruins. I mean, there's the archaeological Heemskerk, right? Forum that we saw. His cityscapes, those I'm not sure that we see actual visible present-day ruination in them. So I think you're when you said Rome is a place of ruins, you mean like ruins from classical antiquity that are still visibly present in the city, or images? I mean, I'm also thinking of Amy Ng's work, which is artists beyond the center, trying to indirectly imagine the ruined city. And then, of course, there are the crazy. There are a couple of ceramics based on the porn stuff about the sack of Rome. So those are the images of. But you're saying that it's not just ancient ruination of the city, but also more recent ruination of the city is also present in the Heemskerk, or has been argued to be present in the Heemskerk?
Yes.
Yes.
But I would say both.
Mm-hmm.
That he should have statues not standing but toppled.
Mm-hmm.
For example, seems to be a recent, a consequence of this finish.
Oh.
And for St. Peter's is, of course, a modern ruination.
Right.
The church is intentionally torn down by Julius II at the beginning of the 16th century, and he would have known that. But he's also showing the ancient ruins, and all of these things sort of get conflated in those drawings. But I guess the more general question was, or the place I was trying to go is there are artists had been traveling to Rome from the middle of the 15th century precisely to study ruins, and all of the drawings that were circulating everywhere would have been drawings of ruins and descriptions of Rome. Describe the city in the same way. It's hard to imagine that anyone could have thought of Rome in 1527, having seen the city or not, without imagining it as a city that's full of broken down buildings.
Can I add to that, though, because it seems like you're interested in domestic ruin, and
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
somewhat different from the monumental
Yes.
pieces on the ground, which would have been studied by a classicist, but not worried by somebody who's thinking about, one population being uprooted from another. I'm obviously not my field.
And I'm also obviously one of the great sources that I didn't talk about a lot for like what Rome is like architecturally after the sack in terms of more recent domestic stuff is when ambassadors from various Italian states returned to the city for the first time throughout the course of 1528, and the kinds of things they write about the city they encounter. And it is very much about the domestic space and the people who are no longer there, and the desolation of kind of a living city. So that is also informant in my mind, which is why I guess I'm not doing a good job at connecting that kind of domestic ruination with the more general Rome as this, trans-temporal city of Rome. Of ruins. So I think that is part of the problem, or part of what's in my mind that's leading me onto this kind of domestic. And then the detail about the house beams and how this would connect to, again, thinking how would the Mesoamericans have encountered this space based on their own traditions. But your question also partially connects to Lisa's about this tradition of indigenous archaeology, which we know is super important, and how much that would have been activated. And would they have been, I would imagine the Nahuas, yes, would have been able, not knowing this archive of visual images of Rome, this European archive, broadly speaking, would have thought differently about ruined kind of stone monumental architecture versus kind of ruined wooden domestic architecture. So that's kind of an answer. But do send me, we'll have to talk, the Christoph thing sounds like a must read.
We have coffee after.
Very good.
Zainab, you have a question?
You want 3 artists doing in a row?
You're all sitting together, so it's all one question.
Well, my question, first of all, Byron, thank you. This was a delight to listen to. And I was a math nerd when I was in high school, and this reminded me of those mathematical proofs that they would make us do, and then they would say, show your work, and we really showed every step of the work. It's really a kind of rigor that is, amazing. But it also reminded me of this thing that Daston and Gallison say about epistemology, which is that all epistemology begins in fear. So it makes me wonder, man, what are you afraid of? if you don't mind me asking. I mean, are you, because you're really, I think, proposing here a different way of working, that where we show our work much more rigorously, more than the footnote, more than the, and you know, is it about what Ben was asking about low resolution, high resolution? Is it about accuracy? Is it about precision? Is it about a certain kind of sloppiness when you talk about things that happen across the ocean? Is it an anxiety about, you called it alphabetical architectural evidence or source, but I think it's to be more Keplerian, it's more alphanumeric kind of source. I know it's not fear of theory, because I know your other work. So I just wonder, can you tell us more about this incredibly rigorous, almost mathematical proof degree of historical argumentation, which I find very compelling, but I want to hear more about it.
Sure. Partially I talk about alphabetic sources just because of the prompt here, but also in Mesoamerican studies it's very important to say there's alphabetic writing as a particular genre of writing, because of course Mesoamerican people had all sorts of writing systems before the Europeans arrived. So that's partially out of that, like being very precise, oh, this is a particular provincial Mediterranean writing system and it's not at all universal. What I'm afraid of, also this came up, I guess, partially with Ben. I mean, it's a common tradition in trying to do transatlantic stuff to kind of outsource one side of the Atlantic or another to secondary sources. And I mean, each, as we know, national historical traditions since the 19th century had asked very different questions and have paid attention to different sorts of archives. So I found in practice that if you actually want to do interesting multi-site work, you can't just inherit the bibliography from one side of the Atlantic. It's been written according to all sorts of assumptions about what are good documents, what are good questions, and you really need to start the projects with kinds of parallel questions on both sides. And ideally, often, as with the Bad Christians book, one can actually find parallel documentation from both sides. So kind of, or there's a whole genre of transatlantic edited volumes, which are actually like a bunch of people doing one side of the Atlantic or the other, and they're sort of put together in one cover. Or there's the genre of comparing Mesoamerican Muslim stuff, where part one is Muslims, because they're in the past, in the 15th century, even though, you know, Islam is not illegal in Valencia until 1526, and then the Native Americans are the present. So I wouldn't say it's a fear, but kind of more of an annoyance with that kind of approach to asymmetrical or lazy outsourcing. I'll also say, so I was, I studied with Marshall Solins way back in the day in the middle of the US, and he was always insistent on the power of the microhistorical anecdote, and of course microhistory is also super important. So the idea of, like in the discovery of the true savage, again, gunpowder, when talking about why in the Fijian Wars are all these European firearms being used as clubs and not as projectile weapons, and why is one hung in a temple? From that, actually George Stocking was also obsessed with the telling detail. I think that also, history to my background is why I'm totally interested in the superfine detail and how you can go from that. I mean, in the classic Italian tradition of microhistory as opposed to the biographical tradition that develops in the US, how you can what are the techniques from going that precise detail to the bigger kinds of structural things that the Italian school of microhistory was interested in.
Answers it? That's good, yeah. Annoyance is the answer.
Oh, and sorry, what I'm afraid of is, well, okay. being the art historian and not the historian, because history is history and art historians are not historians. Being the Latin Americanist who's dabbling not only in Spanish history, but in Italian history. I mean, that's even worse. So I'm well, there are all sorts of hierarchies of disciplines and of area studies, which bizarrely remain very much in play. I was recently was told that works of scholarly history have 10 pictures or maybe 20, but more than that, it's no longer a work of scholarly history and moves, it's popular history or maybe illustrated history. So Bordel is illustrated history, civilization and capitalism, FYI. So my fear, yes, my fears are all about being denounced as an imposter who does not control the language or the detail or is just sort of theorizing broadly. So that's that is the fear I live in constantly.
I know Lasse has a question, but I'm going to jump in with my question, which is for Ben. And by the way, thank you both for playing along with us and this amazing work. So, but Ben, your provocation is that the American neoclassicism, which arrives, which we've been taught to think of as francophone, maybe anglophone or something, but it's actually not only, let's say, Hispanicizing, but it's Romanizing. It's like via Livy. Is that? I mean, it's a wonderful provincialization of the American classical tradition. Is that something that we would? Do you imagine that being followed in literary sources or in? Because you showed a building.
Sure.
I don't know. I'm just asking you.
I think it's, or even historically, I mean, I think it is American classicism of the early 19th century is an Orientalism.
Right.
It's produced out of volumes that were, funded by the Atlantic slave trade and by the sugar plantations, and it is extracted from the dross of the lived environment of the Ottoman city. So I think that's how there is a Mediterratlantic, to use Byron's term, dynamic, that has obviously by that point accelerated and mutated in certain very interesting ways. But I do think if you just follow that metaphor of catalysis, I think this wouldn't be a mathematical equation, this would be a chemical experiment, but I think we can get from
but so the image we would get is that,
that
the image we would get is that instead of the Jefferson's coming to implant a new antiquity because why not, it's implanting an antiquity because that's already been, it's a taking up of the Cortez's idea, essentially.
Well, certainly the Cortez's idea, and Cortez, I don't know the legal history, but my assumption is Cortez can't claim terra nullius for Spain because there was demonstrably a political authority that existed. So he produces terra nullius through this rhetorical strategy, which is borrowed from accounts of the Roman destruction of various peoples, what then Peralta is called epistemicide, as being this sort of ancient Roman imperial strategy that's then adopted by the conquistadors. And clearly we can inscribe Jefferson within that same story of the production of the terra nullius.
Fantastic. Lasse.
Sure. Thank you to both of you. I have a very uninformed question, but I was struck by, and you brought up the Sturgeon Rabbit drawing, and the way that in Architectural History we talk about that book is as one it's not just a document of destruction, but one in which preservation becomes encoded with a certain moralism, in which you can kind of distinguish between cultures or between societies, on the one hand, that take care of their history and others that do not. And so I was curious, Byron, if there are kind of certain moralisms that you were able to decipher between the two contexts that you look at, where kind of their taking care of ruins or their engagement with destruction is used for like a certain cultural hegemony.
So the first thing that comes to mind is what happens in Tlatelolco in the northern neighborhood. We know there's a sacred building there, which Bernal Diaz says is converted to Santiago, to St. James, by the Spaniards. He's writing in the 1560s. However, already by the early 1530s, there's actually a 3-nave stone church to Santiago in Tlatelolco, which is, as the Bishop of Mexico City's Central Church says, is way better than their church is, in like a pity party letter. He writes to Charles V for more money. So Tlatelolco had been an independent polity up until like 1476, taken over by the Aztecs, ruler executed, and then becomes basically a tribute province of the Aztecs. This is all going to get to rebuilding and morality in a second. After the fall of the Aztec Empire, the Tlatelolcans worked very quickly to restore their ruling line, their ruling family. And one of the early in Nahua accounts from Tlatelolco talks about how when the Spaniards arrived, that was our liberation. So there's this very interesting cultural revival thing that's happening with the rebuilding of Tlatelolco and the building of a church, presumably, it happens adjacent to the sacred plaza. Crucially, the guy in whose name the papal bull for St. James in Tlatelolco is granted, he doesn't go to Rome. It's probably requested by Hernando de Tapia from Mexico City. The bull for Tlatelolco, for the Church of St. James, is issued in the name of Jerónimo Conchano, who was a descendant of the last ruling line of Tlatelolco. So he is actively involved in this sort of revival of the community, the rebuilding of a new sacred building, in competition with what's going on in further to the south. Amusingly, the papal bull for Tlatelolco is probably being requested by Hernando de Tapia, who in the Latin insists that the church for Tlatelolco is the Church of St. James of Tlatelolco in the city of Mexico. So it refuses to say, as someone from Mexico City requesting this by proxy, that Tlatelolco is its own city, but it's part of the city of Mexico still. So you've got this very subtle reassertion of hierarchy. So that's not exactly morality, but that's about kind of prestige and history and identity as connects to, and again, officially no Spaniards can live in Tlatelolco yet. There's not a Franciscan monastery there yet when they build this church, and it's made out of stone. It's better than the church. I mean, it's such that it incites complaints about what's happening in the Spanish city. Cortez also by proxy requests a papal bull, but once again, not for the church in the center of Mexico City, but for the church attached to his hospital. So in both cases, we've got this very parochial thinking of requesting bulls for your own local church, but not for the central church of the Spaniards. And Hernando de Tapia requests funds for a church of San Pablo, also in his particular neighborhood. So again, this is all kind of adjacent to questions of morality and rebuilding, but very much the sort of broadly ethical and superly highly politically charged and competitive process of what does it mean to request a bull for a new church, some of which may not yet exist.
Sounds good. Let me know when you get the last question.
Thank you first for great presentation and also very interesting discussion here. I'm still, trying to organize my thought, but I was intrigued by your pointing us of the use of specific terms in describing actually destruction and demolition, which are taken, of course, from the classical tradition. Now, beyond what we all know for Grafton, the old knowledge, new world that is happening here, I'm trying to look at it. What's happened to these people from Mesoamerica who are coming here? Because if I would look at the Arab sources, area study, art history, so if I look at the Arab sources at that time, they have specific Arab terminology to these ruins, which are defined by the time they are. So you have the old ruins, which be Athar, you will have Hilbe, which would be much more contemporary, you will have Tel, which will be a memorial site of something, and you will have just destructions of piles of stones that are sitting there. So do we have something like that? Do we start to feel the consciousness of time in front of ruins? Or we are just falling again and again to the Roman, old classical, then being transported to another space, be it even Constantinople, Istanbul. Yeah.
Great.
Broadly in Mesoamerica, there's an idea that ruins were produced, that there's a series of creations, each has a different sun, and with the dawning of a new sun, the previous age of creation is destroyed, which is what produces these ruins. In Nuxawi, for example, ruins are referred to as ancient platforms. So the idea is you have an architectural platform, but without the building on top of it that has since been, it's the pyramid without the temple on top, because the temples vanished. In theory, that's translating antiguo lugar. I guess the short answer was I have not thought of the linguistics specifically for Nahuatl. And can I say anything interesting about the Spanish vocabulary? I'm not sure that I can.
Well, the livy that you had was about the act of destruction, burning, the agent of destruction, whereas what you're describing is the architectonic, and what you just said too, the architectonic of the result. So that's very different from what we know of Rome, which is not that something's missing, but on the contrary, that destruction is like, things have overgrown and the columns are beneath or something like that. So it would be good to know, to just look for that.
And I'll confess, I have not actually gone back to look at the original Latin for the livy that's being translated into Castilian, so I don't know how much translation.
By the way, another point with Gallegos, I think he is the one translating the book that you showed us of Herman Cortés. Yeah. So it's the production of Don Pascal de Gallegos. And he is the one who also translated the whole Macari Al-Andalus from Arabic into French. So it might be also there something that
wow. I've totally planted these, this audience.
That's great.
We have to go, but there is time for more in-person discussion afterwards. But first, I just want to thank you very much both, Byron, for a fantastic performance, and Ben for playing along, and everybody for coming.